Okay, let's dive right in. We are heading straight into the upside down.
Or maybe what comes after it.
Exactly. We're talking about one of Netflix's, I mean, it has to be their biggest property, right? Stranger Things.
Absolutely.
The main story is wrapping up, and in today's franchise world, that means one thing. The conversation immediately shifts to, okay, so what's next?
And how do we keep this engine running?
Right.
And the sources you've brought us today, I mean, they're just required reading for anyone who's trying to figure out where corporate needs meet fan culture.
They're fascinating.
They really are, because they don't just, guess at plot points. They're offering this really, really charged cultural critique, but it's all wrapped up in a serious analysis of creative and corporate strategy.
And the stakes for Netflix here are, well, they're monumental.
They're huge.
That's really the first big point our source makes, and it's the critical context for everything else. This isn't just another successful show making a transition.
No.
Our source claims that Netflix is a corporate entity like none other, and they're operating this, super high stakes, competitive streaming landscape.
It's a war out there.
It is, and then they make this incredibly bold claim that Stranger Things is actually the corporation's only truly wildly successful property that has this kind of continuing massive global scale.
Just think about that claim. The implications are staggering.
I mean, if that's even partially true.
Right. If that assessment holds, it means that the long-term health, the subscriber retention for one of the biggest content platforms in the world, rests disproportionately on the success of one single franchise.
Unlike their competitors.
Exactly. Unlike Disney, who has Marvel and Star Wars, or Warner Bros. With E and Harry Potter, Netflix, according to this source, doesn't have that bench of massive generation-spanning sagas.
So the spinoff, it's not just a fun idea.
It's not a creative choice. It's an absolute non-negotiable corporate necessity. They have to do it to maintain market confidence and, fight that churn that just plagues all these streaming services.
It really says a lot about the state of content right now that one show has to carry that much weight.
It's immense pressure.
So our mission for this deep dive is to cut through all of that noise and really navigate two parallel tracks here. On one side, you've got the corporate necessity.
The business angle.
And on the other, the cultural anxiety. We're going to look at the specific predictions, the timing, the setting, this idea of a new mythology, and the incredibly strong cultural critiques that are attached.
And we really need to understand the source's detailed opinions on nostalgia, on what they call cultural subversion, and whether the Duffer Brothers are making a smart business move, or as the source really feels, they're about to accidentally destroy the very thing that all works.
It's a real tightrope walk.
And we have to keep both of those layers of analysis going through this whole discussion. On one hand, you have the creative/business strategy, which, as we'll get into, the source actually thinks is surprisingly intelligent.
Which is the surprising part.
It is. But on the other hand, you have the cultural commentary, which is, it's highly charged. It provides a very specific ideological roadmap for how a pretty vocal part of the audience is judging the original show's shift in content and tone years.
Okay, so let's start where it all began. The foundation of that original success, according to the source.
The source is completely unequivocal about why the first season of Stranger Things became this colossal, world-beating hit.
Okay.
It all boils down to one single factor: intense, specific 80s-ness.
But it's more than just, retro cool, right? It's not just the fashion of the music. The source argues the show's success was really built on the promise of the 80s itself, an era they define in very specific cultural terms as a kind of a high watermark.
Precise. They characterize the 80s as a period where, and I'm quoting them, our American culture was really thriving.
Thriving.
And this wasn't just about box office numbers. In their view, it was a cultural peak, a time, and again, this is a direct quote from the source, before all the wokeness was there, before all the Netflix diversity cast there.
And that phrase right there, before all the wokeness was there, that is the core of what we can probably call the nostalgia contract.
That's a great way to put it.
The show promised a return to a very specific cultural moment, an idealized, maybe even a purified version of that path. And any perceived move away from that purity is what fuels the entire critique we're about to get in.
And to back up this idea of a culturally thriving period, the source lists several very specific, iconic, and these aren't just random pop culture references. They see them as pillars of 80s storytelling that prove the era's narrative strength.
Okay, so walk us through those. What are the key benchmarks? What's the evidence the source is pointing to?
Well, they start with the big ones, the major film franchises that really define what a modern blockbuster even is. They point to when the Star Wars and Star Trek films were just hitting their stride and gaining this massive cultural momentum.
The golden age of the sequels in some ways.
In some ways, yeah. They also mention the groundbreaking adventure films like Indiana Jones. These franchises, in the source's interpretation, represented pure, almost aspirational story, good versus evil.
And then they throw in a really fascinating kind of a deep cut that shows just how specific their nostalgia is and also their obsession with sequels and continuity.
The Last Starfighter.
Yes, The Last Starfighter.
It's such an interesting choice because, unlike Star Wars or Indy, it never became this huge, sprawling franchise.
The source likes that.
They love it. They specifically express satisfaction with that fact, noting that it was never followed up on. And this is where they immediately pivot to their broader theory that sequels and follow-ups are, in their words, always a problem in franchise.
That's a critical point. It's almost a preemptive critique. It introduces this idea that these pure original concepts from that era should be, preserved in amber.
Exactly. And that any attempt to extend or revisit them just risks corrupting them.
Yeah.
So even while they're celebrating the success of the 80s, the source is already laying the groundwork for why a Stranger Things spinoff is, by its very nature, a dangerous project.
It's a tightrope.
For sure. They also cite, of course, Dungeons and Dragons becoming big in the 80s, which is obviously the central metaphor and the whole structural foundation for the show and the friend group.
Right.
So all these things, these films, the specific style of gaming, this perceived cultural innocence, in the source's view, that's what defined what people loved about that era. Stranger Things was supposed to be a sacred shrine to that time.
So if we put this all together, the foundational framework is set. The show got huge by reviving a very specific, very idealized version of the 1980s. And that success, according to the source, rests on this implied cultural contract of purity. So when the story has to move forward, any perceived deviation, any sign of the modern world creeping in, is immediately seen as a betrayal of that original promise.
Precisely. They established that the audience who fell in love with the show did so because it represented a cultural moment before what they call woke elements or forced diversity mandates.
And this foundational belief that the 80s were great because certain things were absent, that's what structures their entire critique of the later seasons of the show.
And that's exactly where the tension begins for them. They loved the pure nostalgia, but they feared the strategic necessity of Netflix needing to keep the story and therefore the whole franchise going.
Which takes us right to the point where the source claims the original series just completely went off the rails.
Right. The argument is that after those first phenomenal seasons, the show stopped being a faithful representation, and instead it morphed into what they define as a modern reimagining.
So the argument isn't about a drop in quality, in terms of plot or special effects. It's that the fundamental cultural contract was broken.
Yes, that's it exactly.
They feel the creators started bringing in contemporary social issues and modern casting ideas, which retroactively kind of spoiled the original nostalgic appeal for them.
That's correct. This shift is interpreted as moving beyond just a fun pastiche and starting to align the story and the casting with what they see as contemporary progressive mandate. And in their view, that inherently contradicts the historical reality and the setting of rural 1980s.
And the source is extremely specific about what this deviation is. They list 4 key additions that, in their view, made up this shift and turned the show into a nightmare.
And we have to be impartial here and just list these claims exactly as they appear in the source material.
Well, absolutely. What are they?
The 4 primary claims that define this alleged shift were, first, Netflix diversity casting; second, the inclusion of woke elements and feminism; third, the representation of race; and finally, the introduction of LGBT.
So the central thesis is that these elements were corporate or ideologically mandated insertion that served to modernize the 80s setting in a way that felt inorganic to the show's original premise and its setting.
The source views the evolution in casting and character focus not as some natural development, but as a calculated corporate mandate of night that fundamentally changed the show's nature from an authentic 80s tribute to a modern Trojan horse.
And this belief then structures their reaction to all the fan speculation about the spinoff.
Yes. Before any official details came out, there was all the speculation about what the continuation would look like, and the source immediately identified one popular theory as the logical and feared woke path for the franchise.
And that was, of course, the big theory about a spinoff focusing on Holly Wheeler, Mike's younger sister, and her group of friends. So how did the source interpret that fan theory?
Well, they connect it right back to the original show's structure. The foundation of Stranger Things was built around 4 boys and their D&D game, The Party. And the source argues that the perceived woke solution to continuing the series would be to intentionally flip that gender ratio and focus, thereby replacing the original male-centric group.
And the source even interpreted the final scenes of season 5, regardless of what the actual intent was, as setting up this structural change, shifting the focus to a new group.
Yes, and when they describe this anticipated new D&D group, they use phrasing that is very clearly meant to be provocative and, frankly, stereotypical.
What was the phrasing?
When discussing this potential new group, the source described the anticipated shift as focusing on, and we're quoting the source material precisely here, 3 girls and a guy who looks kind of fruity.
Wow.
Yeah.
The significance of that specific phrasing is that it really just encapsulates their entire interpretation of the intent. This was seen as an obvious attempt to turn this into a girls' show, right? Like we do with everything.
And therefore, they classify it as a clear woke or feminist move that was intended to replace the established male focus of the franchise with a mandated diverse group.
It just highlights how deeply interwoven the source's strategic predictions are with their cultural critique. For them, a simple shift in focus from Mike, Dustin, Lucas, and Will to Holly and her friends wasn't a creative evolution.
No, it was the logical conclusion of the original show's alleged decline into this nightmare. The initial fear was that the spinoff would just double down on all the perceived shifts, and it would all culminate in this girl show.
It's really remarkable how quickly the source connects casting decisions, character focus, and social theme to this big overarching narrative of cultural subversion and a betrayal of that nostalgia.
For this critique, the spinoff was initially feared to be the logical conclusion of the perceived ideological takeover of the original.
Okay, so despite all that speculation about Holly, the source had a central, very strong prediction for the actual setting of the spinoff that will be set in the 1990s. And this is a really crucial pivot point in their whole analysis.
It is, because the source does not see the 90s as, a neutral setting for nostalgia like the 80s were initially. For them, moving into the 90s is strategically and ideologically significant. They define the 90s as the precise era where Gen X got off the rails and where the systematic, foundational subversion of our culture truly.
So the 90s setting isn't seen as a continuation of nostalgia. It's seen as a license for cultural decay.
Exactly. And the acceleration of what they perceive as negative social trends. They argue that the 90s provided the foundation for the woke elements that the source sees manifesting fully today.
And they provide concrete examples of what they believe defined that cultural shift in the 90s. It wasn't just, the music or the fashion.
No, it was the narrative content. They point to the rise of specific types of content, like increased drug use in film, the elevation of the anti-hero, characters who defy traditional morality, and a pervasive push for what they just call edgy stuff.
And the source focuses really heavily on the shift in language and humor as evidence of this cultural course.
Exactly. They cite the dramatic rise in coarse language, and they specifically reference the style of Kevin Smith film, where characters might say the F word every other word, alongside the widespread use of crude humor, which they just sum up as fart jokes.
So they see this shift from the earnestness of the 80s to the aggressive anti-authority humor of the 90s as a core example of subversion.
And this fear connects directly to the creative control the Duffer Brothers would have. The source worries that setting the spinoff in the 90s will grant the creators carte blanche, full license, to be far more subversive and to push boundaries much further than even the most criticized later seasons of the original show ever dared.
So that's the key takeaway from the 90s prediction. The 80s setting provided a kind of cultural guardrail.
A supposed one, yeah. The show is anchored by a certain degree of perceived historical innocence, even if the later seasons pushed against. But by moving to the 90s, the source believes the creators are intentionally removing that guardrail entirely.
And giving themselves explicit permission to bring in all the edgy, crude, and subversive elements that, in their view, defined the decade.
And they bring this back to a specific, though brief, example from the main series finale. That line about, "I don't like girls," which they see as a sign of this provocative, shifting social context. And they fear that will be dramatically amplified.
So it's the normalization of cultural boundary pushing,
Yeah.
but on a grander, decade-specific scale.
It means that for the source, the choice of a 90s setting isn't just a benign creative decision.
No.
It is a strategic allowance for increased cultural boundary pushing, which they perceive as fundamentally detrimental to the quality, the tone, and the original appeal of the Strange.
That is a very complex lens to view a spin-off through. It transforms a simple time jump into a narrative of cultural decline.
And to really solidify their theory of cultural subversion that began in the 90s, the source offers one of its most controversial and detailed claims. It's about the calculated method by which new social elements were introduced into popular culture during that decade. And we have to delve into this argument carefully because it's so central to their critique of the era's content. The focus here is on the alleged calculated introduction of lesbianism into pop.
All right, this theory seems to hinge on a crucial distinction the source tries to draw between different types of representation to support their concept of subversion.
That's right.
They draw a very clear, and I have to say, highly subjective line between what they call real lesbians and the specific content that was actually presented on screen in mainstream media.
Yeah.
How does the source differentiate those two?
Well, the source attempts to define what they see as the authentic, non-idealized version, claiming that nobody in reality likes the real lesbian.
Okay.
And then they use this highly specific, non-standard, and frankly, pretty derogatory jargon. They liken this real identity to examples like this Jemadar. Jemadar. We have to be crystal clear here. The source uses that term, which is a highly specific and, non-standard piece of derogatory jargon, to compare what they perceive as authentic lesbian identity with the idealized version seen on television. The implication is that this is the non-idealized, authentic reality that would not appeal to a mainstream audience.
But the content that actually made it to TV screens in the 90s, according to their analysis, was the complete opposite of this perceived reality.
The direct inverse. It was the palatable, idealized version, what they call the fantasy lesbian.
Right.
Exactly. The TV representation that became culturally visible in the 90s, referred to as hot girls kissing, was, in the source's very specific view, engineered for commercial purpose, and one related specifically to the heterosexual male.
And the alleged goal was?
The alleged goal, they claim, was not authentic representation, but to provide content for you to get excited as a guy. This, in turn, they argue, was a calculated tactic to get young men hooked on pornography.
That is an exceptionally strong claim about the perceived motivation behind the 90s portrayal of same-sex relationships.
It's huge.
The source is basically positing that the initial, seemingly edgy or titillating representation was essentially a gateway used to normalize and commercialize more explicit content. And they were leveraging male viewership to introduce social elements into the mainstream that might otherwise have been rejected.
That is precisely the core of their theory of cultural introduction and permeation. They argue that this representation wasn't about authentic identity or nuanced storytelling. It was a Trojan horse used for commercial and ideological purpose. This tactic, they argue, was key because it allowed these elements to creep it in there to start in a way that was appealing and non-threatening to the mass audience.
And according to the source's structural theory of cultural shift, this tactic was highly successful.
Very successful. It allowed the content to move from being an edgy novel to being culturally omnipresent.
And they believe this process worked perfectly in allowing the content to take hold until it permeated the culture and was everywhere.
And once those elements were normalized and ubiquitous, accepted in mainstream shows, music, the source argues that the path was cleared for further expansion later on, which leads directly to the concerns the source has about the current state of Stranger Things and its modern alleged woke element.
It's interesting. This source is giving us not just a review of a show, but a highly specific ideological roadmap for how they believe culture operates and changes over time.
It is. The level of detail and the clear structural link they draw between 9V and the current state of content is remarkable.
So if we connect this detailed theory to the bigger picture, the prediction that the spinoff will be set in the 90s carries the weight of all these specific cultural anxieties.
Exactly. The source sees the 90s as the decade where this slow, strategic introduction of subversion allegedly began, which justifies their fundamental fear that the spinoff the 90s setting to dramatically accelerate the subversion they already saw developing.
A compelling, if very controversial theory, linking the strategic pivot to the 90s with a specific cultural trajectory. Now, let's ground ourselves back in reality.
That detailed cultural theory really takes us to the height of speculation, but now let's ground ourselves back in some concrete information.
Okay.
Ross Duffer, one of the creators, provided a much-needed update that just cuts through a lot of the fan-driven theories, including those rooted in the cultural critique we just discussed.
And this update serves to definitively dispel some of the major plot speculation. Duffer confirmed two things that the spinoff will not be.
And they were both popular theories among fans and critics.
So what were they?
First, and this directly addresses the specific anxiety we discussed in Section 2, they are explicitly not Percy Hawley storyline.
So that's off the table.
Completely off. That specific speculation, which the source had immediately flagged as a potential woke move to transition to a girl-focused narrative, is definitively gone.
Okay, and the second point, it addresses the hardcore fan. Duffer specifically notes that there will not be a Montauk spinoff.
Right, and while that seems like just a minor geographical detail, the source clarifies that this was an important, almost mythical wink to the fans, deep cut.
Why is Montauk so significant?
Montauk was the original working title for the main show. It was the early concept that eventually became. So by debunking this theory, it confirms that the creators are moving away even from the earliest, most foundational DNA of the original series. They are not trying to resurrect the first of their.
So if the spinoff isn't following the existing kids and it's not a retread of the original idea, what is the defining feature? What is the core confirmed detail of the spinoff?
Duffer stated it will be something much smaller in scale, which is a telling strategic move in itself, and crucially that it will possess an entirely new mythology.
An entirely new mythology. That is a colossal creative declaration.
It is.
And the source immediately interprets this as the creators not wanting to really build upon what's there before. It's an intentional, clean break from the established rules of the Upside Down and the threats they've already defined.
But here's the delicate balance they have to strike. They can't break everything. They are bound by the audience's need for closure.
Right.
The confirmed details state that the spin-off will connect the original in one specific way. It must answer some lingering questions from the main show's finale.
And the source notes that one of those unresolved plots everyone is talking about is the briefcase situation.
The briefcase, yes. It's the necessary trade-off for creative freedom. The creators want new lore, but they acknowledge the audience needs some narrative hygiene regarding specific unresolved plot points. Duffer confirms the spin-off will delve into that and explain that.
The audience needs to know what was in that briefcase.
Yeah.
They need to know what happens to those characters on the periphery of the main plot.
They do.
So how do they reconcile this need for continuity with the desire for a new mythology?
Well, the official line attempts to draw a very fine. While it answers those loose threads, it is confirmed to be a confront mythology. And Duffer clarifies that this means it will not keep exploring the mind flayer. The promise is that it will be very fresh, very new, and it will avoid the narrative obligation.
This confirms a key strategic choice. They're prioritizing creative freedom and a new direction over the continuous exploitation of the Upside Down's main villain.
And this strategic move is where the source, very surprisingly, finds praise.
Okay, so despite the deep-seated cultural anxiety, this is where the source actually offers a clear strategic compliment to the Duffer Brothers.
It's a big twist in their analysis.
They call the move to pursue a disconnected new mythology an intelligent move, and exactly what the creators should.
That is high praise, especially coming from a source that fears the show is being corrupted by ideology.
So why is this specific strategic move, the decision to create new mythology, so sound, according to the source?
Well, it relates directly to what they call the perennial prequel problem that has just plagued modern Hollywood.
The prequel problem.
The source argues that the trend of relying on prequels, which really got huge after George Lucas's Star Wars prequels, is just fundamentally flawed and structurally destabilizing for a universe.
Like us.
Because prequels inevitably screw up the universe, and worst of all, they create massive continuity problems. The writer has to constantly work backward toward an established endpoint, and it just ties their hands.
Let's delve deeper into their supporting evidence for this, because they back it up with some very specific, well-known examples of major franchise failures that they attribute directly to this prequel concept.
Okay, so they cite the Star Wars prequels themselves as the primary example of a failure that screwed up. For instance, how do you explain C-3PO's memory being wiped in Revenge of the Sith, only for him to apparently remember every trilogy?
Or the whole midichlorians thing.
Exactly. The retconning of the mysterious spiritual force into the biologically measurable midichlorian. These kinds of backward additions often just diminish the magic and inevitably contradict the established lore.
And they don't stop with Star Wars. They point directly at Disney's Marvel Cinematic Universe, a property whose recent struggles are widely discussed.
They do, and they specifically call out Captain Marvel as the domino that destroyed the empire.
That's a huge claim.
It's an extraordinarily strong claim. And their reasoning is that a prequel movie like Captain Marvel is structurally unsatisfying because the audience already knows the character's ultimate fate and role. The movie has to fit into a pre-existing timeline, which limits the dramatic stakes and forces writers hoarded explanations that they argue just doesn't fit and doesn't feel good for the overall saga.
And they also mentioned Black Widow as another example of this flawed strategy.
Right, a prequel movie designed to give a character an origin story after she's already. The source asserts that Hollywood just defaults to this prequel trend, even though, in their view, it doesn't allow for proper character development. It introduces continuity nightmares and ultimately diminishes the narrative power of the original.
So the contrast is clear. If you pursue a storyline that is disconnected in time and features new characters, even if it shares the same universe, it's creatively liberating.
That's the advantage of disconnect. The source points out it's actually easier on you as a writer because you don't have the constant headache of worrying about stepping on the toes of the original series or the need for perpetual continuity checks. You can create new stakes without having to explain why those stakes don't exist.
So the Duffer Brothers are essentially applying decades of lessons learned from major franchise mismatch. What model, then, does the source hold up as the undisputed gold standard for successfully extending a universe without screwing it up?
The ultimate successful model they cite is Star Trek, The Next Generation. And the source argues that the key reason TNG worked was the deliberate and extensive distance it put between itself and the original. It was set 80 years past Star Trek.
That time gap, 8 decades, that provided massive creative flexibility. You didn't have to worry about, running into Captain Kirk at the commissary or explaining why Starfleet technology suddenly looked better or worse.
Precisely. Any developments or dramatic changes in technology, Starfleet's governing structure or cultural explained simply by the passage of time. They didn't have to worry about contradicting or retconning Captain Kirk's adventure. They could build an entirely new framework, challenges, new uniform, and a whole new set of philosophical questions.
And the source believes the Stranger Things team understands this now and is applying that same essential logic to their spinoff by creating an entirely new mythology.
It seems so. And that's valuable knowledge for any media consumer, realizing the strategic insight is often the difference between a universe that thrives for decades, like Trek, and one that collapses under the weight of its own continuity, like the source argues happened with the MCU.
And the source even speculates that another successful Netflix property, Cobra Kai, which is also will probably follow this exact model with a completely new set of kids.
The key strategic takeaway here is that freshness, disconnection, and distance from the core lore are more important than direct continuity-heavy fan service when you're trying to sustain a global franchise for decades. This decision, strategic, is viewed as brilliant.
Now we have to loop back to the cultural critique, because the source's strategic acknowledgement doesn't get rid of their core concerns about the show's content.
No, in fact, they believe the strategic move, the intelligent move, actually enables the very content they fear.
It's the ultimate double-edged sword.
It is. The source predicts that the license gained from creating an entirely new mythology, likely set in the 90s, and potentially moving the location to a major urban area like LA rather than rural Indiana, will just open the door to heavier amounts of what they consider undesirable.
And the context of the location matters hugely here, doesn't it?
Massively.
The source argues that rural 80s Indiana provided a kind of geographical and historical constraint, a place where certain elements, like gradually increasing diversity, didn't make sense to them when they were introduced in the later seasons.
Yes, they look back at the original casting, mostly white people in rural Indiana, and they note the addition of diverse characters later on, claiming it was getting a little too diverse for 80s Indiana and thus lacked context for them. The small town setting was an implicit constraint.
But if the spinoff is set in the 90s, say in Los Angeles or another major metropolitan area, that geographical and historical constraint disappears entirely.
And that gives the creators the license.
So what do they predict?
They predict that this new license will result in heavier diversity casting, which in their view is a mandate rather than an organic narrative choice.
Okay.
And secondly, and this is the main driver of their content anxiety, they worry about an amplified focus on LGBTQ stuff, with the general recurring concern being that, and I quote, Netflix loves to take things and make it gay.
And the 90s setting is also expected to increase the edginess we talked about earlier.
The coarse language, the anti-hero tropes, yeah. Pushing boundaries that the perceived innocence of the 80s nostalgia factor previously constrained. The new mythology, therefore, is not just a fresh start for them. It's a vehicle for accelerated cultural change within the franchise.
So we arrive at the source's extremely nuanced, almost conflicting take.
We do. They acknowledge that the strategic decision to disconnect from continuity and create a new mythology is structurally sound and smart for maintaining creative quality and avoiding the prequel problem. That's the high-level comp.
But the trade-off is the content. The potential cultural elements, what the source perceives as increased subversion, heavier diversity mandates, and a focus on specific social themes enabled by the 90s setting. That remains a major overriding concern for them.
The source is essentially weighing the structural health of the franchise against what they term its ideological purity. They prefer the structural solution, the TNG model, but they dread the content that this new creative freedom allows the writers to introduce.
So it's a pragmatic acceptance of strategic quality, paired with an intense ideological fear about the narrative direction.
What a deep dive.
It really was. We've managed to synthesize two wildly different critiques of the impending Stranger Things spinoff. One focusing on high-level corporate strategy, and the other on deep-seated cultural anxiety, all based on the single source material.
And the two main threads for you, the learner, are crystal clear. First, there's the sophisticated strategic reason. The Duffer Brothers appear to have internalized the catastrophic failures of continuity and prequel fatigue that we've seen from major franchises like Marvel and Star Wars. They are opting instead for a distant Star Trek, the next generation style new mythology to keep the universe creatively fresh.
And that is strategically sound. The source believes it's the only way to sustain the property long term.
And second, there are the intense cultural anxiety. The source views the proposed pivot to the 90s and the removal of the 80s restraint not as an arbitrary setting change, but as an enabling mechanism.
A mechanism that allows for what they perceive as the accelerating decay of quality through woke insertions and cultural subversion that they argue began in the original series.
So you now understand both the creative business strategy and the complex critical framework through which a vocal segment of the audience is already judging this new chapter, even before a single frame of film has been produced.
It's a battle between the creative liberation of a new mythology and the expectation of ideological continuity.
It really is.
So what does this all mean for the creators? Given the source's emphasis on the need to respect continuity, solving the briefcase situation, versus the desire for freshness with this new mythology, what's the greater challenge for the creators in the long run? Is it the technical difficulty of tying up loose threads and explaining the finale without relying on familiar villains like the Mind Flayer and Vecna? Or is the true challenge finding that necessary balance, that perfect pivot point between catering to the powerful, lucrative force of 80s nostalgia and truly launching an entirely new mythology in the 90s that satisfies their corporate masters without alienating their most culturally protective and anxious fans?
That is the question.
Something for you to mull over as you watch the inevitable trailers roll out.
Indeed. We'll see you next time for the next Deep Dive.